at 7 in the morning on the 30th of June, 1908, a man was sitting on his porch at a trading post in central Siberia. He was about 60 kilometers from the middle of nowhere. And then, in his own words, the sky split in two, and high above the forest the whole northern sky appeared to be covered in fire. A wave of heat hit him as though his shirt was on fire. Then a sound like artillery threw him from the porch and across the ground, and the windows of the trading post shattered. Whatever had just happened, it had happened 60 kilometers away. At the center, 80 million trees were already falling. It was the largest impact event in recorded human history. And it would leave behind a mystery that still is not fully solved. Because when people finally reached the center of the blast, there was no crater at all. Chapter 1. The morning the sky split. The explosion happened over the basin of the Podkamennaya Tunguska River, one of the emptiest places on Earth. Almost no one lived there. The few who did were the Evenki, reindeer herders who had lived in the taiga for generations. Some of them were thrown into the air. Their tents, their tools, and hundreds of their reindeer were simply gone. The blast wave spread out across the planet. Seismographs across Eurasia registered it as though it were an earthquake. The pressure wave was detected as far away as Britain. In fact, the pressure wave circled the entire Earth, and instruments recorded it passing a second time as it came all the way back around. And then came the strangest part of all. The nights stopped getting dark. Across Europe and Asia, for days afterward, the sky glowed through the night. In London, people reported being able to read a newspaper outdoors at midnight, with no lamp at all. Photographs were taken in the small hours of the morning by nothing but the glowing sky. The whole northern hemisphere had just been handed overwhelming evidence that something enormous had happened, and almost nobody connected it to a remote forest in Siberia. Russia in 1908 was a vast, poorly connected empire on the edge of revolution. A fireball over an uninhabited swamp was simply not a priority. Local newspapers carried a few wild accounts of a falling star and a thunderous crash. Then the story faded, and the forest was left alone with its dead. And so, one of the most violent events in human history sat unexamined, in the middle of Siberia, for nearly 2 decades. It would take one stubborn scientist, and a great deal of suffering, to finally go and look. And what he found there made no sense at all. Chapter 2. 19 years to the Epicentre. The man who finally went was a mineralogist named Leonid Kulik. He had become convinced that a giant meteorite had struck Siberia, and that somewhere out there was an enormous crater full of iron. In 1927, 19 years after the blast, Kulik led an expedition into the taiga. The journey was brutal: frozen rivers, swamps, insects, and guides who were terrified of the place. The local Evenki refused to take him all the way to the center. The place was cursed, they said. It belonged to a god of fire who had come down from the sky. When Kulik finally pushed through, he saw something no one had described. For kilometer after kilometer, the forest was flattened, millions of trees lying on the ground. And the trees were not lying randomly. They had all fallen in the same direction, pointing outward, away from a single central point, like spokes radiating from the hub of a wheel. By following the direction the trees had fallen, Kulik could walk inward, toward the center. He was certain that at the heart of it he would finally find his crater. But as he reached the very center, the flattened forest did something bizarre. The fallen trees gave way to trees that were still standing upright. They were stripped completely bare. No branches, no bark, just naked poles. Scientists would later call it the telegraph pole forest. It was the signature of a blast that had come almost straight down from directly above. The trees beneath it kept their footing while everything around them was knocked flat, but that downward blast had not left a hole. Kulik searched, and there was no crater. There was no giant meteorite. There was nothing at the center but standing dead trees and swamp. Kulik returned again and again over the following years, convinced the iron was buried somewhere in the bogs. He drilled, he dug, he drained marshes. He never found it. He died in a prisoner of war camp during the Second World War, the central mystery of his life still unsolved. The crater he was sure existed was never there to find, because the thing that did this never actually hit the ground. Chapter 3. What actually exploded? Here is what scientists now believe happened. A chunk of rock or ice from space, perhaps 50 to 60 meters across, came screaming into the atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second. At that speed, the air in front of it could not get out of the way. It compressed into a wall of superheated gas, and the pressure on the object became unimaginable. Somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometers above the forest, the object lost. It could not hold together against that pressure, and it detonated in midair. It did not crash. It exploded, releasing its energy all at once, as a fireball and a shockwave, high in the sky. The energy released is estimated at the equivalent of 10 to 15 million tons of TNT. That is roughly 1,000 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. An airburst is why there is no crater. The blast happened in the air, so it scorched and flattened the forest from above, but nothing solid slammed into the ground to dig a hole. It also explains the standing trees at the center. Directly beneath the blast, the shockwave traveled straight down, snapping branches but leaving trunks upright. Off to the sides, it hit the forest at an angle and knocked everything flat. It even explains the glowing skies over Europe. The explosion threw enormous amounts of dust and ice high into the atmosphere, where it caught the sunlight from below the horizon and scattered it across the night. The airburst model fits almost all of the evidence. But one big question refuses to settle. What exactly was the object? One camp argues it was a stony asteroid. A rocky body would explode at exactly the right altitude, and stony fragments would be hard to spot in a remote swamp decades later. The other camp argues it was a fragment of a comet, mostly ice. Ice would vaporize completely in the airburst, which would neatly explain why no meteorite was ever found. Both ideas work, both have problems, and because the object erased itself, we may never be able to say for certain which one it was. Whatever it was, it destroyed itself so completely that it left almost nothing behind. Chapter 4. The pieces that don't fit. Almost nothing, but not quite nothing. Decades later, researchers sifting the soil and the tree resin found microscopic spheres of melted rock and metal, scattered across the blast zone. These tiny spherules are the kind of debris you would expect from a vaporized cosmic object. They are a faint fingerprint, but they are not a smoking gun, and the debate has never fully closed. Then there is a lake. About 8 kilometers from the epicenter sits a small body of water called Lake Cecco. In 2007, a group of Italian researchers proposed that Lake Cecco might be an impact crater, dug by a surviving chunk of the object that made it to the ground. It would be a tidy ending, but most scientists are not convinced. Sediment cores from the lake bed appear to be far older than 1908, suggesting the lake was already there long before the blast, so the lake is probably just a lake. And the cleanest version of the story stands. A cosmic object arrived, exploded in the air, and annihilated itself, leaving only flattened trees and a dusting of glass. The lack of a crater, the missing meteorite, the strange standing trees, none of these are really unsolved mysteries anymore. The airburst explains them. The real mystery that remains is not what happened in 1908. It is what it means for us, now, because the object that did all of this was small. By the standards of the solar system, 50 meters is nothing, a pebble. And there are a very large number of pebbles, and Tunguska had one piece of staggering good luck. It detonated over one of the least populated places on the entire planet. The Earth turns once a day. If that same object had arrived just a few hours earlier or later, the same patch of sky would have been over a city instead of a swamp. An airburst like Tunguska over a major city would be one of the worst disasters in human history. And nothing about 1908 was special. It was simply where the dice happened to land, and the dice are still rolling. Chapter 5. It will happen again. We did not have to wait long for a reminder. On the 15th of February 2013, a much smaller object, only about 20 meters across, exploded over the Russian city of Chelyabinsk. It was a fraction of Tunguska's size, and it still blew out windows across the city and injured around 1,500 people, mostly from flying glass. And nobody saw it coming. It approached from the direction of the sun, where our telescopes are blind. The first warning anyone had was the flash in the sky. Today we are getting better at watching. Telescopes scan the sky for near-Earth objects, and we have cataloged most of the truly enormous ones, the civilization enders. But the Tunguska-sized objects, the 50-meter city killers, are small, dark, and numerous. We have found only a fraction of them. Most are still out there, unseen. For the first time, we are also learning to do something about it. Spacecraft have now shown we can nudge an asteroid's path, that a threat seen early enough is a threat we can deflect. The whole game is to see them coming. Tunguska's lesson is not that the sky is dangerous. It is that the sky is not empty. and that we were lucky once. 80 million trees fell in a place where almost no one was there to see it. The next time, the dice may not roll in our favor, which is why a flattened forest in Siberia is one of the most important warnings we have ever been given. More than a century later, you can still see it. The forest around the epicenter never fully recovered, and the pattern of the blast is still written into the land. The largest impact in recorded history left no crater and almost no trace. Just a scar in the trees, and a question hanging over every quiet night sky. If you want more stories from the edge of what we understand, subscribe to Strange